your thoughts on T boosters, because I know Tony and I have talked about the various T boosters that are being promoted online, and also different forms of creatine.
Yeah, absolutely. So the T boosters, this is pretty crazy. Look, it's like this was like 10 years ago. It was a $2 billion industry, and I think it's just higher. So now it's even higher in the last few years. And you have things like the traditional tribulus, you have the fenugreeks, you have the zinc, the maca, the ashwagandha, and then you have the tonkat alley. So you have a bunch of these different types. Recent meta-analysis just kind of shows that, okay, they looked at all of these different supplements there that are used, but they have a few caveats. So one they say is like, well, first of all, there's not enough evidence that any of them really work in large part, and then a couple of them don't even have like an established like mechanism of action, which to me is kind of like fundamental, right? Like, okay, well, if it does this, like, how does it do that physiologically? Show me the pathway in which it creates this increase in testosterone, or maybe increases your free testosterone. And a lot of them don't even have that mechanistic component there in when you actually read the literature. But the other things that we actually see as well is a lot of them have multi-ingredients, so it's hard to kind of put it on one ingredient. The meta-analysis specifically said there's anywhere from like 8 to up to 50 ingredients in there. So 50? You really can't 50. So you really can't say it's just fenugreek or it's just the tribulus, because you have all these other things that are working in there. And of course, you never know with these supplements because they're not necessarily tested. So is it really just those ingredients, or did they put maybe an anabolic prohormone in there before, right, that maybe does increase it because it's a prohormone, or maybe an actual even, I read one study a while back where some supplements were laced with like small dosages Dianabol. It's like, yeah, I'm getting jacked at all this. It's like, well, yeah, you're taking Dianabol.
I think Dianabol is pretty cheap, so that would make sense too. I think it would go back to cost effectiveness, but that would be effective.
Yeah. So when you see it, I really just see, I just look at it with caution. The other thing is the toxicity of some of these have not been really studied, so we don't know what some of the potential side effects are. And some of them do have these side effects without any of the real benefits. So you're basically getting side effects of doing like anabolic steroids without the same benefit. And so to me, it's like, if you're going to do it, might as well just, try to take the real thing. If you're going to,
I'm real hesitant at ever giving someone advice on taking these herbs, because I think you hit the nail on the head that mechanistically, it's like, you ask the same questions, like, well, okay, let's say it does what it does, but how does it do it? And there's no mechanism of action. And I think that's what's really problematic for me. It's like, I tell people, hey, if you want to try it. But, it seems like these things they have a life cycle. They show up and they become real popular. Then they disappear. Yeah. And then someone else promotes it. And it's like, holy crap. Now I'm getting questions about the same stuff, that I was getting 10 years ago. Who knows? Someone might start asking me about, ferulic acid or something. I don't know if you remember ferulic acid. Or no, my favorite. Did you ever try Smilax?
Oh yeah, Smilax. I remember that.
It was like sublingual or.
Yes. I even bought it when I like 20 some years ago.
Yeah, it's like we tried all this stuff.
It's like I'm gonna get ripped. Just watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's funny how this stuff just sort of comes full circle. Your thoughts on the different forms of creatine?
Yeah, so we did a really cool study, a little different approach to some of them, but we went on Amazon.com and we were interested in seeing, it's like, hey, like how many alternative forms of creatine are sold on Amazon.com? So we did a search. We literally just went on Amazon on a particular date, and then we just put creatine and just so all the products that came out, that were just called themselves creatine. And then we actually found, I took a few notes, 175 different creatine supplements, 16 different forms of creatine were actually in there. So, we have like your creatine ethyl ester, we have the creatine serum, we have the creatine nitrate, creatine citrate, all different sorts of, my favorite brand I have to remember was called Creatine. creatine, and the way that they marketed themselves is and differentiate was because they have 10 forms of creatine, making it the most effective, right?
Creatine. God forbid it was creatinine.
Yeah. So it was, really, we did an analysis of what's the cost per gram. And then of course the cost per gram for creatine monohydrate supplements is like 12 cents per gram, whereas for the alternative forms of creatine, it's about 26 cents per gram. So, and the evidence, kind of shows, when you look through it is, creatine monohydrate still the gold standard. There's really not going to be, currently there's no evidence showing that anything else is better than the creatine monohydrate. And that being said, I always kind of put an asterisk next to that. So just because something is not better than today doesn't mean that there's not something that's going to be better than at some point in time, right? So I think it's still, because creatine still has some limitations. We're looking at some of the brain research now, and we see, okay, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier as well as certain other things, or not as certain other things, but as well at the levels of creatine content in the brain aren't quite as high when you take creatine monohydrate. You see a lot of non-responders in that. So are there other potential forms that may do it? Maybe not. Right now, I always kind of leave an open statement, kind of that scientific lens of, just because that's it today doesn't mean that that's going to be it forever. We have to keep an open mind and keep investigating further to see what things show. But ultimately, that's kind of what we found. Most of them had very limited evidence in terms of there was just either very few publications or no publications on scientific publications on these particular forms. And again, I kind of just earmark that again, where again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means we need to look further and see if there's other potential forms that maybe at some point will work. One that's interesting to me is the guanidino acetic acid, which is the creatine precursor. And Dr. Osijek has been doing a lot of work in that for the last few years. And there's actually some pretty cool evidence to show that, hey, there's some promise there. And particularly when it comes to the brain creatine with that. But there's a lot of toxicity stuff that kind of needs to be, hammered out before that. And there are some products that are coming out with that. Of course, it takes a little longer to raise muscle or blood creatine content because it's got to convert it in the body. It's got to get methylated, so it's a little bit different rather than the creatine monohydrate. So yeah, that one's actually pretty interesting. And I read another interesting study on creatine nitrate plus creatinine. And Dr. Osijek actually did this study too.
Wait, you said creatine nitrate plus
creatinine? Yeah. So the study had a creatine nitrate group. It had a creatine nitrate plus creatinine group. And then I can't remember if it had placebo or a creatine group. I can't remember what the third group was, but they actually compared the effects of this stuff, and they actually wrote a little paragraph. They don't understand the mechanism, but they actually hypothesized that creatinine can potentially turn back to creatine. Right. It's not necessarily a waste product per se. So the article is actually pretty intriguing. It just came out a couple years ago, and it actually had similar effects to the creatine monohydrate group, I believe. So that was a pretty interesting study.
Yeah, that's not one I would have ever thought of. And the brain stuff is fascinating. It really is.
It really is.
And I think maybe we need higher doses for, getting it into the brain, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's kind of why the guanidino acetic acid in brain creatine is quite unique, because it needs to cross the blood-brain barrier, but the brain can obviously produce its own creatine, but maybe it could use the guanidino acetic acid, and that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and then it methylates maybe in the brain. I mean, I'm just throwing hypotheses out there. I don't know, but these are all potential things that I think, hey, there could be something there, to see where it goes. There was one study that actually did see that GAA was actually better than creatine monohydrate at crossing the blood-brain barrier. So that was pretty interesting. But that's only one study. I always say, hey, just because it's one study doesn't mean that it's one study. We got to take it. It's all a piece of the puzzle, right? We got to
exactly.
Same thing. Even one study is negative doesn't mean it doesn't work either. It's like it's just another piece of the puzzle. We got to look at it in different ways.
Absolutely. Tony, you have any final comments before we let Dr. Escalante?
Well, no, just some really fascinating information. I think you touched upon a lot of things that we've been wondering, particularly in where we started, the potential causes of death in the bodybuilders. And I am very surprised that the expedited atherosclerosis and atherogenesis is occurring so quickly, but really good insight, very interesting. And it leads us to some of, maybe if nothing else, Guillermo, some of the ways we can behave, or practices bodybuilders can take to mitigate this, even in the presence of supraphysiological dosing, right? And I think that would be helpful, like looking at the lifestyle, a healthy lifestyle for the bodybuilder. Tough to achieve with all that training and high dosing, but maybe there are preventative measures that need to be considered while doing both, whether it's low intensity cardio for the heart itself or the left ventricle, who knows, but fantastic stuff. I found this really interesting.
Yeah, Guillermo, this is great. Definitely appreciate you coming on. It was a fascinating conversation. I love this stuff, and we could have talked forever, but gotta let you go. And I do want to make one crass commercial message to promote the ISSN conference, June 15 to 17, Fort Lauderdale Beach. It's right on the beach. So if you're listening to this, make sure you come to the ISSN conference. The three of us will be there. So otherwise, gentlemen, thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.